can you count all of the money and do the books balance? It was much more focused on operational auditing. What's the best way to do a function? How can we squeeze the most value out of what we're doing? Are we operating at the highest degree of efficiency? What do we need to change in order to make our business operate better? And are we complying with all the rules, regulations, laws, etc., that we have to in order to keep the chairman out of jail? That was a high priority. And so that I did. And then my last job at Fidelity, I headed what's called the Risk Oversight Group. And the Risk Oversight Group means everything that can go wrong. So that if you're an investor, you will know if I was doing my job that the only way you lost any money is because you were dumb in the way you invested your money. But we didn't do it. And we took that very seriously. It was great to work for a company that really believed that it had a fiduciary responsibility to take care of the 18 million investors who had trusted the company with their money to manage their life savings. And at that time, we were overseeing approximately $1.3 trillion in other people's money. And to make sure that every penny was accounted for and that the departments that I was responsible for, which were audit, security, regulatory compliance, SEC compliance, the ethics office that dealt with how managers manage their own personal money so that there weren't conflict with investors, risk management, records management, and probably a few other things that I've forgotten. And that was a job that I thought was a great job. It was a job that when I started out, though, at the same time, with this conglomeration of functions, we had a budget of about $105 million a year to do that. And in 2 years, I cut that to $80 million a year. And we did all the same things, and I'll argue that we did it better because the first place that I focused on in terms of operational efficiency was under our own roof. Something that perhaps government ought to think about doing. You know? Government doesn't speak, as you know, in Montpelier, the same language that we speak here. You know, to government, you know, you've heard all these language things about cuts, these dramatic, draconian, awful cuts. Well, to a cut in government, it means reducing the rate of the growth of spending. Doesn't mean cutting any money. And that's why, for example, in the governor's general fund budget this year, it actually went up 5.3% while he was making all of these cuts. And this happened year in and year out. And that's, again, a lesson. Well, I retired from Fidelity, but not before September 11th. And September 11th was a significant day in that I was overseeing the risk function, among other things, at that time. And I was in my office in Boston when I heard that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And that was significant because we had 700 employees directly across Liberty Street at the World Financial Center from the World Trade Center. That subsidiary processed about 10% of the trades on the New York Stock Exchange in any given day. It was an absolutely key operation, both for Fidelity, certainly, but for the street in general. And our building was effectively destroyed by the debris from the World Trade Center. It took us a week to find all of our employees. If you remember, communications were very, very difficult in the days after. And people, you know, walked home, walked across the bridges, and so on. We finally did find all of our employees. Only one was injured, and we had no fatalities. We were very, very fortunate, unlike some of our colleagues at other businesses there. But the key task was to make sure that we were up and able to account for all of our customers' money, all of their stocks and securities, and that our business could continue. And in 4 days, we were back up and running. We were back up and running because we maintained, through contingency planning, a function that I was also responsible for a couple of years prior. We had hot sites across the river in New Jersey, literally flick a switch, and all of our computer systems were live, and we could make sure we lost no data and no time. But the one thing that we didn't think about as well as we should have, and that's again a lesson learned, was you can back up all of your systems and you could be prepared to resume business. But what happens if you lose all your people? And some other businesses did lose all of their people. Contingency planning and planning for disasters is critical. We learned that in Irene. And I think one of the reasons that Irene went as well as it did for the state of Vermont is that we did have plans in place. We did have a command center in place to be able to deal with an emergency. But everything didn't go perfectly, but it went pretty well. But now's the time to learn from those things that went well, those things that could be improved, to build a better contingency planning system for the future. And what's so critical when you talk about contingency planning is that you have to make sure that you plan for tomorrow's disaster, not yesterday's disaster. It's too easy to do that. And the key is looking for the disaster that you haven't really thought about and to think through it thoroughly. That's the crime risk analysis piece that I talked about doing years and years ago. And that's really what the essence of that is. So post 9/11, and of course during all of this time, that we're talking about this, my office was in Boston and I lived in Swanton. All the time that I worked at Fidelity, I lived in Swanton. I've lived there for the past, 27 years, and in Ripton before that. And my typical day was to get up at 5 to 5:30 in the morning, drive to Burlington, get on an airplane, fly to Boston, and then turn around and come home at night. And I did that for about 15 years. That's what you do when you love Vermont and you want to live in Vermont. And there were about half a dozen of us who worked in the financial district in Boston and who commuted fairly regularly, not necessarily every day. But that becomes a way of life. And as I've mentioned before, it's always fun to get into the office about 8 in the morning and have somebody from Wellesley call and say they can't get in because the roads are bad. You'd be surprised how often that happened. Well, I retired in 2003 and devoted myself to helping my wife around the house. And that lasted about 3 weeks. And she suggested that I might try to find something productive to do. And I took a look at the suggestion of a friend who said, you ought to think about running for state auditor. And I've been involved in politics. I've been in the Franklin County Committee and the Swanton Town Committee for years and done some fundraising and so on. And I looked at the auditor's office and, I said, there is kind of a problem here. And the problem was we weren't getting financial statements done at all. We were doing audits that were coming out 18 months after the end of the fiscal year. And those are like archaeology surveys. They're not audits at that point. And there's no reason. You can't run a business, and a government is in fact a business, when you get your financial information a year and a half after the books are closed. I was fortunately elected state auditor, and that was the first task, was to clean up the mess. Now, I had run on a platform saying I wanted to clean out the auditor's office. I didn't realize until I got there that I needed a bucket, a mop, and some soap because the place was filthy. It was a disaster. And again, that's a lesson that, people can't be proud of doing a job unless they've got some pride in their environment. And that was kind of the first step in cleaning up the auditor's office, was literally to clean up the auditor's office. And we did, and we turned the auditor's office around. One of the first things we did is we stopped hiring, we started hiring better people. Because that's key. One of the things I learned a long time ago in business was that the first thing you do in a new job is you hire your replacement. When you start hiring people who are smarter than you, who know things that you don't know, who can move things to the next level, that's the key to turning a business around. And during the time that I was in the auditor's office, we only hired people who were certified in some function, whether it be a CPA, a certified fraud examiner, a certified information systems auditor, people who could actually make the office advance. And in 2 years, I think for the first time in Vermont history, we did 3 annual audits to get us back on track to where we ought to be. So we had financial statements, both that made sense, that were accurate, that were leaner in terms of the change in approach to the audit function. And that at the same time, they were audits that helped us move from a AAA bond rating from a AA bond rating to a AAA bond rating. There are a number of factors that you need in order to improve the bond rating, but one of the things that you need is you need to be able to demonstrate to the rating agencies that you have control over your financial affairs and that you can produce statements that are accurate and on time, and that we were able to do. That AAA bond rating means millions of dollars in lower interest costs to Vermonters throughout the state for the borrowings that the state and all of our municipalities do. It's important to have that rating, and we're one of 6 or 7 states in the country now that has the AAA bond rating. People say right now in running for governor that, well, I'm running against an incumbent, and incumbents, you know, always win. We haven't defeated an incumbent governor in Vermont in 50 years. It's about time, isn't it? I had an epiphany along the line some time ago when I had heard before, when I ran for auditor, I was running against a 3-term incumbent, and incumbents never get defeated. And it hit me even later after that, you know, in 3 of the 4 races that I've run, 2 for statewide races and 2 for the Senate, an incumbent has been defeated. So incumbents are not invulnerable. Unfortunately, I've observed before that one of those incumbents was me. But incumbents are not immune, provided you have a case for winning and a case for change. Well, I'm now in my 2nd term in the Senate. I love serving there. I love serving there with Peg and Kevin. I come to the Senate, you know, since there are only 8 of us Republicans with very low expectations. That's the way we survive, isn't it? But occasionally we do some good. And it's not just plugging holes and putting fingers in the dike. Occasionally we can produce an idea that even Democrats will accept to move us forward. And so now I'm running for governor. I'm running for governor because I want to achieve a number of things that I think will make Vermont an even better place than it is. You know, for 200 years, Vermonters have been characterized by being independent, self-reliant people. And in the last few years, that's begun to change. It's begun to erode. And we now have in place a government and an administration who believes, with almost religious fervor, that they know more than you do, that their way is the right way, that theirs is the only way, and that you should do what they want you to do. With regard to health care, they can design a health care system for all that you've got to be a part of. You do not need to be presented with too many choices about your health care because they know the choice that you need. We had people testify before us who said there are too many Blue Cross Blue Shield plans. It confuses people. You're too dumb to figure out what you need or what your family needs. We have plans before us that look at things like mandatory recycling, that they will decide what you do with your garbage, not you. And that even people who are moving very, very rapidly towards recycling because it makes sense, they're going to compel you to do it. By 2014, it's going to start. Just like the healthcare exchanges and so on are going to start. Remember George Orwell writing 1984? Well, he just made a mistake. It's 2014. And if we continue down the road, that's exactly what it's going to be. So what are the things that we need to do in terms of getting us moving on the right track? Well, first of all, we've got to ask ourselves some fundamental questions. Like one of the questions about healthcare is, how much of your freedom are you willing to give up to save money? Because in the bill that we passed this last year, just to take as an example, we've empowered a 5-member, unelected, unaccountable board right now, without the legislature doing anything else,